Hello, and welcome to Reading the Gospels Together for Tuesday, April the 21st. And today's an exciting day because we're beginning to read the Gospel of Mark together. If you haven't made your way through all of the Gospel of Matthew videos, you can still do that. Go to our website at www.zionpress.org, and you can find there a whole list of all of those videos that we've done since the middle of March. But today we begin the Gospel of Mark, and we're going to begin with an introduction. First of all, who is Mark? Well, lots of biblical characters had more than one name. There was another one named John this time, but this one is also called Mark. And Mark was the son of yet another Mary, in whose home some believers met to pray for Peter's release from prison. We read in Acts chapter 12, verse 12, "When this had dawned on him, Peter went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, also called Mark, where many people had gathered and were praying." John Mark accompanied Paul and Barnabas in their apostolic journeys when these two traveled together. We read in the book of Acts in chapter 12 again, "When Barnabas and Saul had finished their mission, they returned from Jerusalem, taking with them John, also called Mark. And when afterwards a dispute about Mark caused a separation between Paul and Barnabas, Mark, according to Paul, had suddenly deserted them. Mark accompanied later on his uncle Barnabas, and Silas became the new missionary companion for Paul." Now, Mark was later reconciled to Paul, and we find Paul again employing Mark's assistance, recommending him and giving him a very honorable testimony, referring to Mark as a fellow worker. At the end of his life, Paul asked Timothy to bring Mark to Rome so that Mark could assist Paul during his time in prison. We read in 2 Timothy chapter 4, Paul writes, "Only Luke is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you because he is helpful to me in my ministry." And that's very high praise from Paul. Around the same time, Peter said that one called Mark was with him in Rome too. Peter called this Mark his son, his spiritual child through conversion. And in 1 Peter 5:13 we read, "She who is in Babylon," which is Peter's word for Rome, "chosen together with you, sends you her greetings, and so does my son Mark." Now, was this Mark the same Mark that helped Paul? Most scholars assume him to be the same Mark because there's no historical evidence that indicates there was any other Mark of note in the days of the early church. We know from Paul that Mark was in Rome. We know from Mark's early conversion stories that Peter was very closely associated with that family. So John Mark's our guy. Now, so what about the authorship? Well, the majority of biblical commentators agree that the writer of the Gospel of Mark is in fact this very same John, whose surname was Mark, who mainly worked with Paul and also with Peter. And when he was with Peter, he heard Peter's preaching in Rome and interpreted Peter's words and wrote a gospel primarily based on Peter's testimony. Now, how do we know this? Well, there's some very, very early authorities telling us about this. A fellow named Papias, and he was active from about 60 AD to 130 AD. He was a disciple of the Apostle John. Papias said that John made this comment about Peter's relationship to Mark's gospel. John said, "Mark, who became Peter's interpreter, wrote accurately, though not in order, all that he remembered of the things said or done by the Lord." Another early church father, Irenaeus, writing around 180 AD, says, "Matthew published a gospel while Peter and Paul were preaching and founding the church at Rome, and after their departure," or the word could also mean after their death, "Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, also gave forth to us in writing the things which were preached by Peter." Yet another authority, Clement of Alexandria, he was active from about 150 to 211 AD, is still more specific, and he says this, "The gospel according to Mark came about in this way. When Peter had publicly proclaimed the word and by the Spirit preached the gospel at Rome, those who were present, being many, urged Mark, as one of Peter's longtime followers who remembered what was said, to make a record of what had been spoken. And he did this and distributed the gospel among those who'd asked him. And when this matter came to Peter's attention, he neither strongly forbid it nor urged it on." And that's a very important reference because that tells us that this gospel was written during Peter's lifetime, and Peter himself approved its use. And so that's a big, big statement regarding its accuracy. Now, Eusebius, the great church historian himself, gives this account. When he collects all this information together, what he hears is this, that Peter's audience was so penetrated by his preaching that they gave Mark, as being a follower of Peter, no rest until he consented to write his gospel as a memorial of Peter's oral teaching, and that the apostle Peter was delighted with the zeal of these men and sanctioned the reading of the writing, that is, of the Gospel of Mark, in the churches. So there's Peter himself saying, yes, these are my words, these are my memories of Jesus, and these can be safely read in the church as an accurate representation of the life of Jesus. So the Gospel of Mark, then, is really the Gospel of Peter as collected and transcribed by his secretary Mark. Now, that's an important piece of information, not only regarding how we can be sure that what Mark says about Jesus and about Peter and the events of Jesus' life are accurate, but it also gives us an insight into Peter as well. And tomorrow, as our introduction continues and concludes, we're going to talk about how to read the gospel in light of what we know about where it came from. It's an exciting time. It's eyewitness testimony, direct eyewitness testimony about the life and words and actions and miracles and nature of Jesus. So I'm excited to be reading it together with you. We'll see you tomorrow. In the meantime, it's never too soon to get started on the Gospel of Mark. See you tomorrow.